At 1:52 in the morning, Whitfield Pharmacy was the only lit window left in Belhaven, Pennsylvania, and Josephine Hartley was being held down against the counter by two men she'd never seen before in her life. The big one had her right arm pinned flat to the wood. The other one had a fistful of her hair and was hauling her backward, away from the phone, away from the silent alarm button sitting a hand's width from her fingertips that might as well have been across the county. Her cheek was pressed against the cold counter. Her left hand, the one they couldn't reach, was closed around a ring of keys so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 3 customers were waiting in the store, and not one of them stood up. "The cabinet keys," the man holding her said. His voice was calm, almost bored, like he was reading off an invoice. "Hand them over. I walk out, and this is finished before 2 o'clock. She breathed hard through her teeth. "No. You have any idea what you're standing in front of?" "Yeah." She got her chin up just far enough to look at him. "The medicine cabinet for this whole town." And that was the moment the streetlights outside went black. It wasn't an outage. Out in the dark lot, cars began rolling in with their headlights off, one behind the other, easing into 2 straight rows until there were 19 of them, and not a single door opened. No horns, no voices, just steam coming off 19 hoods in the freezing air. Then the pharmacy door swung open. The man who walked in wasn't the biggest one in the room, and he wasn't wearing anything worth noticing, just a black wool coat and a plain silver ring on his little finger. He didn't look at the 2 men. He looked at her face, then at the keys, still locked in her fist. The man holding her turned around, and every muscle in his body rearranged itself at once. He said one word, and it cracked apart in the middle. Voss. Whatever he'd walked in there expecting to find, it wasn't this. And neither had she expected it. If you're hooked already, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you'd guess. Share it with somebody who still believes ordinary people can do brave things. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Now let's head back inside Whitfield Pharmacy and find out exactly who just walked through that door. None of the people gathered inside the store that night knew they were stepping into the same story. 40 minutes earlier, when the hands of the clock on the wall had only just reached 1:10 in the morning, Whitfield Pharmacy was still the most ordinary place in the world. Josephine Hartley stood in front of the medicine refrigerator, recording the number on the thermometer on the form taped beside it, exactly as she did on every shift. The temperature was steady. She initialed the final box, closed the refrigerator door, and heard the compressor start up again behind her, a sound so constant that she only noticed it when it stopped. On the counter sat the next day's stack of prescriptions. Thin sheets of paper she had to check line by line against the label on every bottle. The patient's name, the medication, the dosage, the dispensing date. She worked slowly and didn't miss a single line, because in this job, one misread word wasn't a spelling mistake. It was someone taking the wrong thing instead of what they needed. When she finished the stack, she pulled a brown notebook with worn corners from the bottom drawer, opened it to the page marked with a small slip of paper, and sat down on the stool behind the counter. That notebook didn't exist in any computer system. No one required her to keep it, and no one paid her a single extra dollar for the hours she spent writing in it. It was something she had invented during one winter or another, when she realized the pharmacy's computer knew who had bought what, but it didn't know who was about to run out of medicine, and was too afraid to say so. Inside were handwritten names, one on each line, with the medication they took, and an estimate of how much they still had at home. The elderly woman at the end of Rockwell Street would run out next week. The man who lived alone above the repair shop had about half a blister pack left. Beside some lines, Josie placed a small dot of ink in the margin, her own private symbol meaning that this person was stretching their doses and believed no one knew. She updated 3 lines, crossed out 1, then closed the notebook and placed it beneath the cash register, exactly where she always kept it. In the waiting area, 3 customers sat scattered beneath the white lights, an elderly man named Curtis waiting for his blood pressure medication, a young mother holding her child on the row of chairs against the wall, and a long-haul driver looking at something on his phone. Josie pulled her phone from the pocket of her coat and made a call. The neighbor who watched her child answered after the second ring, her voice raspy but alert. "She's asleep," the woman said. "She's been asleep since 9 o'clock and hasn't made a sound." Josie asked how school had gone that day. The woman gave a quiet laugh over the phone and said Poppy had come home talking so fast she could barely breathe. Her class had watched a film about dolphins, and the little girl was absolutely certain that dolphins could call one another by name, that each one had its own whistle, just like people had names. She made me try to whistle," the woman said. "I did it wrong. And she told me I'd just called a different dolphin by mistake." Josie stood behind the counter and laughed. A brief laugh, the kind that came from someone who had been standing too long and didn't have much strength left. She told the woman to go ahead and sleep, that she would let herself in when she got home, and the woman said she already knew because Josie told her the same thing every night. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Josie slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked up at the round clock hanging above the cough medicine shelf. 2 hours remained in her shift. In 2 hours, she would lock the door, turn off the lights in the front, leave one small lamp burning in the stockroom, then walk home through the cold. And if she made it back in time, she could still sleep for 4 hours before dawn. She pulled the box of prescriptions waiting to be collected toward her, and began arranging them in alphabetical order, simply because she didn't like sitting idle. Beyond the glass door, the street was completely empty, and inside the pharmacy, nothing was happening at all. It would be another 37 minutes before someone pushed open the door and walked in. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell gave a short chime, and 2 men walked in. Josie looked up from the box of prescriptions, and the first thing she noticed wasn't their size or the way they surveyed the room, but the fact that they hadn't bothered to hide anything at all. The man in front removed his gloves, brushed the snow from the shoulders of his coat, then walked straight to the counter like someone arriving to make a scheduled delivery. He looked to be around 30, with a clean, well-kept face, and when he stopped in front of her, he did something that made her freeze. He unclipped the employee badge from his chest, laid it face up on the counter, and gently slid it toward her with 2 fingertips, exactly the way someone might offer a business card. The laminated badge still looked new. It had a photograph, a name, and the logo of a pharmaceutical distribution company Josie had seen printed on nearly every shipment delivered to the pharmacy. Garrett Lund, the badge read, Collections Department. "I work for the distributor," he said, his voice as calm as if he were confirming an appointment. "You've probably seen my company's name on the boxes in the back room." The other man didn't approach the counter. He was larger, younger, and he moved around toward the door. Josie heard the lock turn once, then the sharp sound of hard plastic striking glass as the sign hanging on the door was flipped over. All 3 customers in the waiting area looked up at the same time. No one said a word. "We don't accept payments at night," Josie said. "If this is about a debt, come back during business hours. Mr. Whitfield will be here from 8 o'clock in the morning." Garrett nodded as though she had said something perfectly reasonable, but he didn't move. "Mr. Whitfield has been here from 8 o'clock every morning for the past 3 months, he said, "and for those same 3 months, I've called him once a week. Do you know what he tells me? He says he has paid every invoice in full, and he has. I'm not arguing about that." He placed one finger against the edge of the badge and turned it halfway around on the counter. "But there's another charge," he said. "A priority distribution fee, $1,400 a month. That isn't much for a place that does the kind of business this one does. He paid it for years, paid it regularly, never missed a month, until last fall, when he stopped. I don't know what he told you, but I came here to remind you that the balance is still on the books." Josie stood motionless behind the counter, and somewhere in her mind, something had just clicked into its proper place. She remembered the shipments that had arrived late for no clear reason. She remembered the 3 medications reported temporarily unavailable the month before, even though the regional warehouse still had them in stock. She remembered the store owner, Mr. Harlan Whitfield, standing in front of the computer for a long time one afternoon, saying nothing, then turning off the screen. "I don't know anything about that charge," she said, "and I don't have any authority over his accounts. Take your badge and leave. We're closed." She said it, then stepped once to her right, toward the old landline mounted on the wall behind the counter, and reached for it. Garrett wasn't much faster than she was. He had simply prepared sooner. His hand was already resting on the telephone before her fingers reached the receiver, and he kept it there, without snatching or pulling, simply laying his hand over it and leaving it still. "Who are you planning to call?" he asked. The question wasn't loud. It was spoken in the voice of someone who was genuinely curious to hear the answer. Josie didn't withdraw her hand. She stood there with her fingertips an inch away from the receiver, listening to the steady hum of the cooling unit behind her, the sound she only noticed once everything else in the room had gone silent. Garrett tilted his head slightly. "The sheriff gets his prescriptions filled here too," he said. "I know what medication he takes." Josie withdrew her hand from the telephone, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that making a call now would no longer mean anything. and she didn't want him to see her hand trembling as she pressed the numbers. Garrett Lund removed his hand from the phone, stepped back half a pace, and continued to behave as he had from the beginning, like a man explaining a matter of business rather than someone forcing another person to obey. "My company doesn't only deliver to small pharmacies like this one," he said. "We supply the regional hospital too, that big hospital outside town. Every department there carries something from us. I made a delivery there last week. They left me waiting in the corridor near the surgical wing for almost 40 minutes because a signature was missing. There was a board on the wall with the surgery schedule posted on it. I had nothing else to do, so I stood there and read it." He spoke the next sentence in the same calm voice he had used when discussing the fee, without emphasis and without pausing for breath. "One of the names on that schedule had the same last name as yours," he said. "A little girl, a heart valve repair, Dr. Aldridge performing the surgery." Then he turned his head toward the medicine cabinet behind her, as though he had just finished mentioning something entirely unrelated and was now returning to the matter at hand. "The key to that cabinet," he said. "Give it to me. I'll take enough to cover what's still owed, and then I'll leave." Josie stood perfectly still. She heard the faint whir of the refrigerator, heard the soft crinkling of the foil on a blister pack as someone in the waiting area squeezed it in their hand, and heard the blood rushing in her ears. He hadn't threatened her once. That was what sent the coldest fear down her spine. He didn't say that if he didn't get this, then that would happen. He didn't say he knew where the little girl was. He didn't say anything she could repeat to the police and expect them to believe. He had only let her know that the name was within his sight, that it had been written on a board in a corridor where he could stand reading for 40 minutes because someone had forgotten a signature, and he left the rest for her imagination to finish. A mother's imagination worked faster than any threat ever could. She looked around the room. Mr. Curtis was staring down at the prescription sheet in his hands. The young mother had turned her back to the counter. The driver was looking up at the ceiling. Josie understood them. She understood them completely. Because if she had been sitting in one of those 3 chairs, she would have remained silent too. And she would have gone home that night and spent years trying to forgive herself for it. She wasn't angry with anyone in that room. She was simply standing on the other side of the counter. And on the other side of the counter, there was nowhere to sit down. The clearest thing in her mind at that moment wasn't her daughter's face. It was the worn notebook beneath the cash register, just inches from her left hand. She thought of the names written inside it, of the tiny dots of ink she had marked in the margins, of the elderly woman at the end of Rockwell Street who would run out of medicine the following week, of the man who lived above the repair shop, with half a blister pack left at home. She thought of the one thing no computer system could ever record, that there were people in this town stretching their doses and believing no one knew. If she opened that cabinet tonight, he would never stop with tonight. He would return the following month, and the time after that he wouldn't need to place his employee badge on the counter, because he would already know that people here could be made to open the door. And the names in that notebook would keep cutting their doses in half, through another winter, and then another, until one of them failed to wake up, and the whole town called it old age. Josie lowered her left hand beneath the edge of the counter, found the ring of keys, and closed her fingers around it. "No," she said. Later, when people asked Josie how long it had lasted, she couldn't answer. She only remembered that it had been much shorter than it felt. What she remembered most clearly wasn't what happened, but what she heard. There was the sound of glass, one dry, clean crack somewhere to her right. The kind of sound anyone who had ever worked in a place filled with bottles and jars would recognize at once, and the part of her mind still trained to keep track of everything automatically thought that she would need to sweep that spot very carefully in the morning. There was breathing, her own breathing, quick and shallow, and the breathing of the man speaking into her ear, slower, steadier, the breathing of someone making no effort at all, and beneath all of it, the steady mechanical hum kept running. It ran with the same rhythm it had kept through all the nights she had stood there, no faster, no slower, indifferent to what was happening 3 steps away. There was something in that indifference that made her strangely alert. She had prepared herself for fear. Fear was something she knew well, something she had lived with for years, something with its own smell and its own temperature. But what rose inside her then wasn't fear. It was anger. And it came from a place she had believed had dried up long ago. Dried up during the season, when she sat in a room where the air conditioner hummed softly and listened as someone read aloud the official conclusion about her husband's death. Wesley had been a welder, and he died one morning when the scaffolding collapsed at the construction site across the river. The company investigated for several weeks, then issued a document stating that he had failed to follow procedure, that the fault belonged to the man who was dead. Josie signed the paper because they told her she had to sign it, and she walked out of that building without understanding that they had just taken something from her even greater than money. From that day on, she had believed she was no longer angry. She had been wrong. The anger had remained there all along. It simply had nowhere to go, and now it had found a way out. She didn't think about her daughter. She didn't think about the notebook. She thought only one thing, clear and cold as a line printed on a medicine label, that it was happening again. Once again, there were people in respectable clothes holding papers in their hands, certain that someone like her would eventually have to sign. Her left hand tightened around the ring of keys. The metal pressed so deeply into her palm that the marks were still there the next morning, and she was grateful for the pain because it gave her something to hold on to. She heard herself say it a second time, and she was surprised by how flat her voice sounded. Then, beyond the glass door, every streetlight along the block went dark at once. The hand gripping her hair let go. Josie straightened, bracing one hand against the edge of the counter, and the first thing she realized was that the man who had just entered wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Garrett Lund. "You have a truck route running through Route 9, he said, his voice flat and low, like a man opening a meeting everyone else had arrived late to. 9 trips a week, sometimes 11. Refrigerated trucks, 2 axles. Your company name painted along the sides. They pass through my river terminal, through my way station, and they leave by the northern bypass so they don't have to stop anywhere." That has been going on for 2 years. Garrett didn't answer. The man took another step forward and stopped at a distance that allowed him to speak without raising his voice. "Do you know how I found out?" he said. "Because for the past 2 years, every month one of my people has reported unfamiliar trucks on Route 9, and every month I've told them to leave those trucks alone because I thought they were carrying hospital supplies. Then last week, someone handed me a bill of lading. It wasn't hospital freight. It was yours. And you never asked anyone a single question. I drove here tonight to ask you one question. Just one. Who gave you permission?" Josie stood behind the counter and understood none of it. From the moment the streetlights went out, she had prepared herself for 100 different possibilities, but none of them looked anything like this. This man hadn't come because of her. He hadn't even looked at her once since walking through the door. He had come because of a business matter, because of several trucks and a route, and she and the pharmacy had simply happened to lie in his path. A thought came to her that was both absurd and bitter, that she had just been saved by coincidence, and coincidence owed her nothing at all. Garrett tried to say something about only following orders from above, that the matter of the route wasn't part of his responsibilities. The man didn't respond. He looked down at the floor, where several shards of glass lay scattered beneath the shelf. He looked longer than necessary. Then he raised his head and looked behind the counter, at Josie's face, at the red mark slowly rising across her cheekbone, and she saw something in his expression change, only slightly, so slightly that she would have missed it if she had blinked. Then his eyes lowered and stopped on the name badge pinned to her blouse. He stood still. She counted 3 beats in her ears before he spoke. "Did you ever work at St. Bridget Hospital?" he asked. The question was so out of place that it took Josie a second to understand it was meant for her. She nodded. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't explain. He only looked at her for another moment, then turned back toward the 2 men and said a single sentence, that they could leave now. Nothing happened after that, and that was exactly what made it terrifying. The younger man, Bo Tillman, unlatched the lock, pushed open the door, and the 2 of them walked outside. Josie watched through the glass. In the parking lot, 2 rows of vehicles sat motionless in the darkness. Every light turned off, and the men walked between those rows for the entire length of the lot. No one stepped out. No one stopped them. Not a single door opened. They simply kept walking, with silent vehicles on either side of them, steam still rising from their hoods, and Josie realized that if someone had rushed out and seized them, it might have been less frightening. At the far end of the lot, they got into their own vehicle and drove away. Inside the pharmacy, the man didn't say another word to anyone. He bent down, picked up the largest shard of glass from the floor with 2 fingers, stood, and placed it on the counter in front of her beside the telephone. Then he walked toward the door. His black wool coat disappeared beyond the frame, and a moment later engines began starting in the parking lot, one after another, then fading into the distance until the road was as quiet as before. The streetlights came back on. The 3 customers slowly rose to their feet, none of them knowing what to say. And one by one they left. Josie locked the door. She walked back around behind the counter, and there she lowered herself to the floor with her back against the cabinet, the ring of keys still pressed into her left palm. Only then did her hand begin to shake. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the pharmacy door opened again, and the man from the night before walked in, this time alone. Outside, the sky had turned a pale silver, and the parking lot was completely empty except for his car. Josie still hadn't gone home. She had spent the entire night on the stool behind the counter. She had swept up the broken glass, wiped down the shelf, and done every task her hands could find so she wouldn't have to sit still. He walked to the counter, and at first, he said nothing. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a wallet, opened it, and removed a piece of paper folded into quarters. He placed it on the wooden surface in front of her. The paper was yellow with age, thin and limp along the folds, softened in the way something becomes after being opened and folded again so many times that the creases are nearly ready to tear apart. The front was an old pre-printed prescription form. Josie turned it over and saw her own handwriting. She recognized it immediately, before she could read a single word, because it was the way she wrote when her hand was tired, tilted slightly to the right, the letters at the ends of the lines growing smaller because she always crowded her words all the way to the edge of the paper. She sat down on the stool. 4 years earlier, during a night shift on the 3rd-floor inpatient ward at St. Bridget Hospital, she had stayed after her shift ended, and sometime close to 4 o'clock in the morning, she had taken a discarded prescription form from her pocket and written on the back of it. When she finished, she folded it into quarters and slipped it into the plastic bag containing the patient's personal belongings, the bag the hospital would give to the family. On the outside, she wrote 3 words, "For the family," then placed her initials beneath them, 2 letters, because that was how people signed things there. Then she went home and never thought about it again. She had no reason to think about it again. "I didn't receive this right away," the man said. He was still standing, without pulling over a chair, both hands resting on the edge of the counter. "At the time, I was being held in another state. It was a case they later dropped and never took to court. But while my mother was in the hospital, I was sitting in a room 7 hours away by car, and no one would let me leave. I called. I called every day. They told me she was doing fine, that there was no need to come back urgently. Then one morning, they told me she was gone. Sometime after 4 o'clock, the funeral home handled everything. Her belongings were placed in their storage." He paused, not to catch his breath, but as though he were deciding whether he should continue. "It was 7 months before I could collect them," he said. The plastic bag was still sealed. No one had opened it. I took out her rosary, and this piece of paper fell onto the floor. I sat in my car in the funeral home parking lot and read it 3 times. Then I drove straight to the hospital. Josie asked who he had spoken to. "Human Resources," he said. I showed them the 2 initials at the bottom and asked who had been working in that ward that night. They searched the computer while I stood there. They told me no employee by that name had ever worked there. I asked them to check again. They searched a second time and gave me the same answer. I went back twice more over the next 2 years, and each time, they told me exactly the same thing. He looked down at the piece of paper lying between them. "I have money," he said. "I have people. I've found men who didn't want to be found. But I couldn't find the nurse who sat beside my mother for 4 hours, because according to the records, she had never existed. For 3 years, I've carried this paper in my wallet, and I haven't known who to thank." He fell silent for a long while, and Josie realized it was the first time since the night before that she had seen him hesitate over anything. "I came here last night because of those trucks," he said. "Because of the route, and because of money. If that company hadn't been running its trucks illegally across my land, I would never have set foot in this town. I searched for you for 3 years. In the end, I found you because of a dirty business deal. You tell me what that is called?" Josie didn't answer that question. She picked up the piece of paper, looked at it for a moment, then set it down, and she said the only thing she felt she could say truthfully. "I don't remember her face," she said. "Please don't be angry. I was responsible for the entire ward that night. I went through many rooms, and under the nightlights, everyone lying in those beds begins to look alike. Even if you showed me a photograph now, I probably still couldn't point her out. But I remember her hand." She raised her own hand to the edge of the counter and repeated the motion without thinking, her fingers loosely closing, searching, letting go, then closing again. She kept holding the edge of the blanket like this, Josie said, all night long. Not the way someone twists the sheets because they're uncomfortable. It was as though she were searching for someone's hand. The third time I passed her room, I stopped. My shift ended at 11 o'clock. I sat down in the chair beside her bed and took her hand, and after that, she stopped searching. The man said nothing. He remained exactly where he was. I stayed until it was nearly morning, Josie said. She could speak, though not much. Sometimes she was clear, and sometimes she wasn't. I wrote down what I heard because I knew someone would need to read it. I didn't know who that person was. I only knew there would be someone. He asked her why. Why had she stayed 4 hours beyond the end of her shift, for a woman whose face she couldn't even remember? Josie thought for a moment, then shrugged, and answered in the most ordinary voice she could manage. I grew up in quite a few houses, she said, and none of them were ever mine, so I know exactly what it feels like to lie in a room with no one sitting beside you. When she finished, she turned away and reached for the cloth she used to wipe the counter, not because the counter was dirty, but because she didn't want the words to remain suspended between them any longer than necessary. He let her finish wiping it down. Then he told her he wanted to repay her. He said it wasn't a polite offer. He laid out each thing plainly, one by one. He would pay for her daughter's surgery. All of it. Without insurance, and without complicated paperwork. The two men from the night before would never set foot in this town again, and she didn't need to ask how that would be arranged. As for the distribution company and its entire collection operation, he had a way to bring it to a stop within a week. All she had to do was nod. Josie set the cloth down. She thought of Mr. Harlan standing in front of the computer screen on an autumn afternoon, turning it off without saying a word. She thought of the brown notebook beneath the cash register. She thought of the elderly woman at the end of Rockwell Street, who would run out of medicine the following week, and of the small dot of ink she had placed in the margin beside her name. "What does doing it your way accomplish?" she said. "It buys one quiet week. Then next month someone else will stand exactly where that man stood last night, wearing a different badge with a different name, and Mr. Harlan will sit in front of that computer again without telling anyone what is happening. You can remove two men. You can't remove the reason they came here." She looked directly at him. "I don't need them to disappear," she said. "I need them to answer for what they've done." He didn't respond at once. He stood there long enough for Josie to hear the cooling system cycle on, and then fall silent again. Then he spoke slowly, as though he were rereading a sentence whose meaning he had only just begun to understand. "People ask me for many things," he said. "They ask me to make a problem go away, to make someone keep quiet, to make a debt disappear from the books. 3 generations of my family have done that work, and we do it quickly. No one has ever stood in front of me and asked me to do something harder than what you just asked." He picked up the piece of paper from the counter, folded it along its old creases, and slipped it back into his wallet. Then he asked for the name of the pharmacy's owner and what time he arrived. Harlan Whitfield arrived at 8 o'clock as he did every morning, and he knew something was wrong before he even crossed the parking lot, because Josie was never still there at that hour. He was 71 years old and had stood behind that counter since before the road outside had ever been repaved. And when he took off his coat and hung it on the hook, Josie saw the faint tremor in his right hand, the tremor he had no longer been able to hide in recent years, the one that forced him to count pills with a tray and spatula instead of pouring them into his palm, as he had when he was younger. He listened until she had told him everything. He didn't ask a single question. He only stood there for a long time, looking at the red mark on her cheek, then walked around behind the counter, pulled out a chair, sat down, and said that all of this was his fault. "I paid that fee for years," he said. "I can't even remember exactly when it started. At first, they called it a priority service fee. It came with a proper invoice and an account code, and it looked no different from any of the other charges on the statement. I paid it and told myself it was simply the cost of doing business. Then one year it went up, and I paid that too. Then I began to notice that the pharmacies that didn't pay had their shipments delayed by 2 weeks, sometimes 3. And during flu season, they had nothing left to sell. By the time I understood what it truly was, I had been paying it for so long that the thought of standing up and speaking about it was greater than the strength I had left." He turned his chair to face Josie and the other man. "Last fall, one of my regular customers collapsed right here in the store," he said. "Right where you're standing. I sat on the floor beside him while we waited for the ambulance. And as I sat there, I knew exactly why it had happened. The next day, I called them and said I wouldn't pay anymore. I thought they would cut off my shipments. I didn't think they would send men here at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. He sat in silence for a moment, then rose and walked to the lowest wooden drawer at the inside end of the counter. A drawer Josie had never once seen open during all the time she had worked there. He took a ring of keys from his pocket, selected a small tarnished one, and inserted it into the lock. "If you intend to do what you told me about this morning," he said, "then there is something you ought to know." The drawer opened. There was no money inside. No accounting ledgers. No envelopes. Nothing resembling what an outsider might have imagined. There was only paper. Small slips, no larger than a palm, cut from old prescription forms, stacked into bundles, held together with rubber bands, filling the drawer from the bottom almost to the rim. Each slip carried a handwritten name, a medication, an amount, and a date. The writing on the slips at the bottom had faded almost completely. The writing on the ones at the top was still dark. Josie lifted one bundle and began turning through it, and she recognized several of the names. "What is this?" she asked. "People who couldn't afford their medicine," Harlan said. "I gave them the medication and wrote it down. That was all." He paused. "I've never asked anyone for a single cent," he said. "If someone remembered on their own and came back with money, I accepted it, but that didn't happen often. The rest simply stayed in there." Josie asked how many slips there were. Harlan looked into the drawer. "I've never counted them," he said. "Once you count them, they become a debt. I didn't want them to be a debt." The man in the black wool coat had remained silent on the other side of the counter the entire time. He stepped closer and looked into the drawer, and Harlan did something Josie would think about for years afterward, without ever understanding why he chose that moment, as though he had been waiting for decades for the opportunity. He reached into the bundle at the back left, the one whose rubber band had nearly rotted away, and moved his fingers through the slips as someone might move through the beads of a familiar rosary, then pulled one out. He laid it on the counter. The slip carried an abbreviated name, the letter A before Voss, the name of an asthma inhaler, a small note beneath it, saying the medicine was for her son, who was 8 years old, and an amount that wasn't very large, still unpaid. The man who could have bought the entire town in a single afternoon stood there looking at the piece of paper that said his mother had once owed money for medicine, and for a very long time, he couldn't speak. "I don't remember her face," Harlan said, "but I remember you. You were wheezing so badly. That year, I didn't think you would survive the winter." The customer who collapsed in the pharmacy the previous fall was named Ruth Ellender, and Josie knew it before Harlan said it, because Ruth's name appeared on the second page of the brown notebook, with a small dot of ink in the margin. That afternoon, Josie walked to her house, a single-story home at the end of Rockwell Street, with a faded wooden fence and a walkway that had been carefully cleared of snow, cleaner than any of the neighboring paths, because Ruth Ellender was the kind of woman who believed a walkway said something about the dignity of the person living inside. She made tea. She asked about Josie's daughter, asked about Mr. Harlan, asked everything she could think to ask in order to delay the thing she already knew Josie had come to say. Then Josie said it, and Ruth Ellender sat staring at her cup of tea for a long time. She was in her 70s, had lived alone since her husband died, and had a daughter far away who called faithfully every week. She said her daughter had a good job, a family of her own, and more than enough responsibilities already. She said it 3 times that afternoon, and each time Josie understood more clearly that she wasn't boasting about her child. "Do you know why I haven't told her?" Ruth asked. "Because if I do, she'll drop everything and come running back here. She'll argue with her husband. She'll take leave from work. She'll carry me away. Then one day, she'll look at me and think her life might have been different if it hadn't been for me. I would rather endure this than ever see that look in her eyes." She told the rest so calmly that Josie found it more painful than if she had cried. She explained that she had learned how to make her medication last longer, and she had learned it well, so well, that it had become a science of its own. She knew how much she needed, and she knew how much she actually used, and she had spent years living in the distance between those 2 numbers. Then she said the one thing she had never told anyone. "Don't tell Mr. Harlan this," she said. "Every year, when the weather begins to turn cold, I feel relieved. Do you understand? When it's cold, I eat less. I don't feel hungry. I sit inside all day beneath a blanket, and when I eat less, I can save 1 injection." She set her cup down. "I've lived through winters when I felt glad that it was freezing outside," she said. "Tell me, what kind of person is grateful for something like that?" Josie didn't answer right away. Ruth Ellender continued, and her voice began to tremble in the place where it had remained steady until then. "Every month, I tell myself next month will be different," she said. "I tell myself that while I'm standing in front of the drawer in my kitchen, and I mean it seriously. I don't say it merely to make myself feel better. I plan to ask the doctor, to call the insurance company, to do something. Then the next month comes, and then the month after that. I've said those words to myself more times than I dare remember." Josie moved her chair closer, and Ruth looked down at the hands clasped together in her lap. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Josie said. "Listen carefully to me. The person who should be ashamed in all of this is sitting in an office with a coffee machine 40 miles away. And I promise you, he sleeps soundly every night. You're the one who stays awake. You're the one who calculates every day. That isn't shame. That is survival." Ruth Ellender raised her eyes to Josie and said nothing for a while. Then she asked whether, if she told people what had happened, she would have to include the part about the winters. Josie told her she only had to say what she felt able to say. Ruth Ellender slowly shook her head. "No," she said. "If I'm going to speak, I'm going to tell all of it. I've hidden this for so long that I can't even remember what I was trying to protect anymore." She stood, went to get a cardigan, and put it on even though the house wasn't cold. Then said she needed Josie to show her where to begin. The woman who came to the pharmacy 2 days later was named Delphine Arcio, and she said she produced an online radio program about the pharmaceutical industry, that she had been following the distribution company for so long that hearing its name now made her tired, and that every time she finally needed someone willing to sit in front of a recorder and say their own name aloud, every door closed at once. She sat at the small table beside the window, listened to Josie's story for nearly an hour, took notes, asked her to clarify several details, then closed her notebook and said she wouldn't do it. Josie thought she had misheard. "I can't do it," Delphine said. "Not because I don't believe you. I believe every word. The problem is that there is a powerful crime boss standing in the middle of your story. If I put that on the air, do you know what people will remember? They'll remember the fleet of silent cars parked in the lot. They'll remember the name Voss. Look him up online. Argue with one another about whether he is a good man or a bad one. And that will be entertaining. That will be something they can share. But an elderly woman in her 70s sitting in her kitchen calculating how many days she can survive this month will disappear from their minds in 30 seconds. She looked at Josie. "I ruined a story like this once before," she said. "A few years ago. I included one sensational detail because I thought it would draw listeners. And it did. And in the end, no one remembered anything about the people who had actually been harmed. I won't do that again." Josie sat in silence for a while. Then she stood, took her coat, and told Delphine to come with her. That afternoon, the two of them sat in Ruth Ellender's living room, and Delphine placed the recorder on the table, pressed the button, and began asking the questions of someone who knew her profession: dates, amounts, names of contacts. Ruth answered slowly. After about 10 minutes, she began telling a story Delphine hadn't asked about, a story about winter. And Delphine reached over and turned off the recorder. She said nothing. She sat there with both hands resting on her knees, looking down at the rug, and Josie saw her swallow once, then swallow again. Ruth stopped and asked whether she had said something wrong. Delphine shook her head. The three women sat silently in that room long enough to hear the soft crackling of the furnace. Then Delphine reached out, switched the recorder on again, pulled her chair closer, and spoke in a voice entirely different from the professional one she had used before. "Tell it again from the beginning," she said. "From the very first time. I won't ask any more questions. Just tell it." They remained there until the sky was completely dark. As they were leaving, standing on the carefully cleared walkway, Delphine told Josie that the episode wouldn't contain a single word about the vehicles in the parking lot, wouldn't mention the name Voss, wouldn't include any of it. She said they would simply let people listen to an elderly woman talk about her winters, and that would be enough. And if that couldn't move anyone, then nothing ever would. That night, when Josie returned to the pharmacy for her shift, she noticed a car parked across the street, directly opposite the glass door. Its lights were off, its engine silent, but someone was sitting inside. The following night, the car was there again, in exactly the same place. On the third night, Josie unlocked the door and stepped outside, intending to cross the street and ask who it was, but the car started and drove away before she had made it halfway across. She stood in the middle of the road in the cold, watching the two red taillights fade into the distance, and she didn't know who had been inside. People expected something loud. Josie admitted that throughout that week, she kept looking toward the parking lot whenever a car turned in, and Harlan had already hired someone to replace the lock on the back door, but no one came. The first thing that arrived was an email notice sent to pharmacies throughout the region, written in language that was polite and dry, stating that because of an internal accounts reconciliation process, certain orders would be delayed by 3 business days for customers who had not yet completed account verification. No one was named. Whitfield Pharmacy wasn't mentioned. There wasn't a single word in it that a lawyer could hold up and call retaliation. Harlan printed it, read it twice, then sat down and said that 3 days was manageable, that he could get through 3 days by calling 2 familiar pharmacies in the neighboring county. The second thing that arrived was an envelope addressed to Josie, bearing the seal of the Professional Licensing Board, informing her that a complaint had been received concerning discrepancies in the inventory of controlled medications at her place of employment, and that a review had been opened. The letter stated clearly that she had the right to submit a written explanation, that she should consider obtaining legal representation, and that during the review she wouldn't be suspended, only that a notation would be placed on her record. She reached the words "a notation" and immediately understood what she had learned 4 years earlier at St. Bridget Hospital, that no one needed to prove she had done anything wrong. They only needed to place a notation beside her name, and after that, every door would close on its own, with no one having to take responsibility for closing it. The third thing arrived on Friday afternoon. It was a letter from the insurance company, printed on heavy paper, with a logo and a customer service number at the bottom of the page. The letter said that the file had been placed under reconsideration as part of a routine review process, that while the review was underway, prior authorization for the scheduled procedure would be temporarily withheld, and that the company would contact her once a decision had been reached, with no time frame given. Her daughter's heart valve repair had already had a date, already had a surgeon's name, already appeared on the board in the surgical corridor where a man had once stood reading while he waited for someone to sign a form. Now it no longer had a date. Josie read the letter while standing beside the mailbox on the porch of the laundromat below her apartment, and she didn't cry. She didn't even feel that she was about to cry. And that was what seemed strange to her. She read it a second time to make sure she hadn't misunderstood anything, then folded the letter into quarters, went upstairs, opened her handbag, took out the brown notebook, and slipped the letter between the pages containing people's names. She left it there, between the elderly woman at the end of Rockwell Street and the man who lived above the repair shop, because she believed that was where it belonged. Then she washed her face, changed into her blouse, kissed the forehead of her daughter, who was sitting at the kitchen table coloring, told her to mind the neighbor, and walked to the pharmacy in time for the night shift. Throughout that entire week, no one threatened her even once. No one called in the middle of the night, no window was broken, and no man stood waiting on a street corner. The evil in this story didn't shout in anyone's face. It sent letters. Josie had to submit a written explanation, and to do that, she needed a copy of her old records from St. Bridget Hospital. So she filed a request, and 4 days later someone called her back. It wasn't human resources. It was a woman who introduced herself by name, then fell silent to see whether that name would mean anything. Marguerite Whitfield. It took Josie exactly 1 breath to understand, and she turned to look at Mr. Harlan, who was standing 3 steps away, and Mr. Harlan turned his face aside. The meeting took place on Tuesday morning in the small room behind the pharmacy, where a wooden table and 4 chairs had always stood. Marguerite Whitfield was in her 40s, dressed in a neatly tailored coat with her hair tied low, and she sat down without removing the coat, the way someone sits after telling herself the matter won't take long. The man in the black wool coat sat at the corner of the table without speaking, and no one introduced him to her. 4 years earlier, Josie had worked on the 3rd floor inpatient ward. She reported a medication dispensing error, followed the proper procedure, put it in writing, and included the lot number and delivery date. 3 weeks later, they called her in and handed her a document stating that she had violated inventory procedures and that the hospital was terminating her employment. She had read that paper many times over the course of 4 years, and she knew by heart the signature in the lower right corner, a neat signature written in blue ink, though until that morning she had never known whose it was. "I signed it," Marguerite said. She said it at the very beginning, without evasion, without opening with a long explanation. "If you want to know why, I'll tell you." At the time, the hospital pharmacy depended entirely on a single distributor, Your report included the lot number and delivery date, which meant it pointed directly at them. Their representative met with the chief executive officer. The chief executive officer called me in, and I was given two choices. Either the hospital lost its supply during flu season, or a 24-year-old nurse lost her job. I chose the second, and I signed within 5 minutes. Josie asked what else she had done. Marguerite didn't avoid the question. I had your personnel file removed from the search system, she said. It wasn't destroyed completely. The paper records remained in storage, but anyone searching the computer wouldn't find anything. I was told to do it that way, to keep things clean, so that if anyone asked later, the hospital would have nothing to answer. At the corner of the table, the man in the black wool coat sat a little straighter. He didn't speak. For 3 years, he had gone to that hospital, shown them the 2 initials written at the bottom of a piece of paper, and 3 times they had searched the computer in front of him and told him no such person had ever worked there. Now he was sitting across a single table from the woman who had given that order. He still said nothing. Marguerite opened her briefcase, removed a file clipped inside a stiff cover, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Josie. "This is the original," she said. "Your complete report, unaltered, along with the internal memorandum and the section that was removed from the official copy. It has dates and the names of the people who issued the instructions. Take this to the licensing board, and that complaint won't survive a week." Josie placed her hand on the file but didn't open it. "You kept this for 4 years, she said. "Yes. You're giving it to me now not because you feel guilty. You're giving it to me because keeping it has become more dangerous than turning it over." Marguerite looked at her for a moment, and Josie thought she might deny it. "That's right," she said. "I kept it because I knew that one day someone would need a person to blame, and I had no intention of being that person. Now everything is beginning to fall toward them instead of me, so I brought it here. Would you prefer that I lie, so you can feel better?" No one answered. The man at the corner of the table stood, pushed his chair neatly back into place, and walked out of the room. He hadn't spoken a single word from beginning to end, hadn't looked at Marguerite even once, and the door closed very softly behind him. Mr. Harlan remained seated where he was. He looked at his daughter, opened his mouth, then stopped. Father and daughter hadn't spoken to each other in more than 10 years, and that morning, sitting less than an arm's length apart, they still said nothing. He came on a Thursday night, close to 11 o'clock, and Josie recognized him while he was still standing outside the glass door. Bo Tillman, the large man who had locked the door and turned the sign around that night. This time he was alone, without his company coat, his hands in his pants pockets, and he waited for Josie to unlock the door instead of pushing it open. She let him in. She didn't know why she did. He was 26, with a face that looked even younger than his age, and he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. "My grandmother lives in the next state," he said. "She has diabetes. She lives alone. I went to visit her last month, opened the refrigerator to get a bottle of water, and saw her medicine sitting inside, the bottle that should have been empty by the end of the month before. I picked it up, and I knew immediately what she was doing. I didn't ask her a single question, because I was afraid she would tell me the truth." He took a small black USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the counter, sliding it toward her with 2 fingers, and the gesture made Josie remember another night in that exact place, and she had to swallow. "There are photographs on this," he said. "Nothing sophisticated. I don't have access to the system. They're only pictures I took with my phone. The delivery schedule posted on the warehouse wall. I photographed it once a week, starting when I first took the job. The printed lists kept in the shift manager's desk. I photographed them while I was working nights. Messages my supervisors sent me. I took screenshots. There are even papers they told me to destroy. I photographed them before I destroyed them." Josie asked how long he had been doing it. Bo Tillman looked down at the counter. "Since my first year," he said. "For 2 years now. I didn't know what I was taking them for. I just kept taking them. I suppose I've known for a long time, but I kept thinking it wasn't my turn to do something yet." She asked why he had come now. "Because that night I was standing by the door, and I heard everything he said to you," he answered, "and I didn't do anything." He raised his head, and this time he looked directly at her. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I know that isn't something a person can ask for. I just don't want my grandmother to be next." Then he walked out. Josie called after him, asking where she could reach him when they needed his testimony, but he only lifted one hand over his shoulder without turning around. 3 days later, when Delphine Arcio needed to verify several details, No one could reach him anymore. His number rang through to the voicemail of a subscriber who had never recorded a name. He had returned the keys to his apartment. The company listed him as having quit without notice. By Wednesday, the very day Delphine's story aired on the radio, Josie stopped calling and placed the USB drive inside her handwritten logbook beside the letter from the insurance company. Late that night, close to 4 o'clock in the morning, the landline mounted on the wall behind the counter rang. Josie answered. The voice on the other end belonged to an older woman, and she was terrified. She said she had run out of her heart medication, that she had tried to wait until morning but couldn't wait any longer, and that she was sorry for calling at such an hour. Josie asked for the name of the medication, and the woman gave the exact name of a heart medicine the pharmacy kept in stock. Josie asked for her name, but she didn't answer. She asked for her address, and the woman recited it slowly, the house number and the street name, then thanked her and hung up. Josie collected the medication, wrote a line in the shift log, locked the door, and walked there because the address was less than 10 minutes from the pharmacy. She found the correct house number. The house was completely dark. There was no car, no footprints in the snow, and no power line still connected to it. The ground floor windows were boarded shut, and the snow covering the front steps was smooth and untouched. The house had been abandoned for years, and everyone in town knew it. Josie stood outside the fence, took out her phone, found the number that had just called the pharmacy, and dialed it. The recorded operator told her the number didn't exist. She called again and heard the same message. She stood there for a long time in the cold, still holding the box of medicine, staring at the boarded windows. And she didn't know whether she had just been trapped, tested, or had somehow missed something entirely. The 3-day delay in deliveries fell during the very week the season's worst storm swept down from the lake. The interstate closed on Monday afternoon. Trucks were stranded at rest stops beyond the hills, and 3 days on paper became 6 days in the real world. By Wednesday morning, Harlan had called everywhere, and no one had any stock left to share. Josie pulled her ledger from the drawer beneath the cash register, opened it to the first page, and began making calls. She called each person one by one, in the order she had written their names, and she asked exactly 3 questions: how many doses they had left, what day they would run out, and whether anyone in their home was able to travel. Then she wrote the answers beside their names. Some had enough to last until the weekend. Some had 2 days left. Some lied, and she heard it immediately, because people always lied in the same way, speaking too quickly and laughing at the end of the sentence. She was able to guide a few of them, give instructions to several others, and move a few bottles from one place to cover the need somewhere else. By Thursday afternoon, there was still a list in the notebook that she could no longer find any way to help, and she sat beneath the counter lights, staring at those names, understanding that another phone call wouldn't change anything. She took out her phone and dialed the number he had given her that day. He answered on the second ring. She hadn't finished her first sentence before he interrupted, and he asked only one question: how many trucks do you need? That night, while the town of Belhaven closed its doors and went to sleep, something that had existed for 3 generations in the Voss family began to move. The trucks didn't take the interstate because the interstate was closed. They traveled routes known only to people in that line of work: the road around the river terminal, the service road along the levee, and steep stretches that passenger cars couldn't climb but 2 axle trucks fitted with tire chains could. They stopped at the regional warehouse across the county line, at 2 large pharmacies willing to share their supplies, and at a distribution station that ordinarily would never open its doors at midnight. For 7 hours, through the snow, their headlights cut across the dense white curtain, and inside the cargo compartments of those trucks that night, there was nothing but medicine. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the first beam of light swept across the pharmacy windows. The parking lot lay beneath deep snow. The entrance had vanished, and there was no way to tell where the pavement ended and the planted beds began. The first person to step forward wasn't part of the convoy. It was Mr. Curtis Halloway, already standing outside, though no one knew how long he had been there, wearing a heavy coat and holding a large flashlight. He waded into the middle of the lot, raised the light, and began guiding the first truck as it backed into place. Then the second, then the third. He stood there in the snow until the last truck had entered the lot, and throughout that entire night, he didn't say a word to anyone about why he had come. By 6 o'clock, the pharmacy was crowded with people. Most of them were elderly, dressed in several layers of clothing. Some had been driven there by their children or grandchildren, while others had dragged themselves on foot across several blocks. Harlan stood behind the counter, dispensing medicine, checking every prescription and skipping no step, no matter how urgently anyone pressed him. Josie stood beside him with the brown notebook open in her hands, reading each name aloud in the exact order she had written it. Not according to where people stood in line, but according to who was closest to running out. No one complained. They stood listening for their names, and when each one was called, they stepped forward. Ruth Ellender stood near the end. When her turn came, she walked to the counter and accepted the bottle from Harlan's hand, but she didn't open it. She didn't put it in her pocket either. She remained right there in the middle of the crowd, holding the unopened bottle against her chest with both hands, and she stood that way for a long time, her eyes closed, until someone behind her gently touched her elbow to remind her to move. By 8 o'clock, the final person had gone home. Josie sat down on the stool behind the counter, lowered her head onto her folded arms on the wooden surface, and meant to close her eyes for only a moment. When she woke, the sun was already high and pouring light deep behind the counter. The snow outside had been shoveled into 2 neat piles on either side of the entrance, and a black wool coat rested across her shoulders. She sat upright, holding it closed with one hand, and looked around. She was the only person left inside the pharmacy. No one knew when he had gone. Tobias Merrick had stood in the parking lot throughout that entire morning. He was the man who had followed Elias's father for more than 30 years. The man who knew every road across 3 counties and knew stories that no one still alive could tell anymore. And that morning he stood beside his car, looking through the pharmacy windows, watching the line of elderly people waiting inside, watching an old woman receive a bottle of medicine, press it against her chest, and close her eyes. He watched that scene for a very long time. That afternoon, he went to the warehouse by the river terminal where Elias still worked, sat down across from him, and said that he was the one who had passed along the information. He told him everything without making anyone ask. He said he had called Sutton Pryor's people 3 times. The first time was immediately after the night at the pharmacy, to report that the matter had touched the Voss family. The second was when he learned that someone in broadcasting was looking into Belhaven. The third was when he heard the words Deputy Attorney General's office. He hadn't taken a single dollar, he said. And he didn't say it as a defense, but because he wanted that number recorded correctly. Elias asked why. Because I was afraid, Tobias said. Do you understand? I wasn't afraid of those men. I've dealt with men like them all my life. I was afraid of the paperwork. Your father never lost to anyone on the street. He lost in a courtroom. I sat in that room and watched them use paper to take apart, piece by piece, everything he had spent 40 years building. When I heard the words state investigation, I could think of only one thing, that this time they would take you apart, and if they took you apart, they would take everything. He stopped there. My son is 27 this year, he said. He has nothing to do with our business, but he carries my name, and everyone knows I belong to the Voss family. If all of this comes down, he won't be able to stand outside it. I didn't do what I did to save myself. I've already lived my share of life. He also admitted something else, that the car parked across from the pharmacy for 3 nights had been his, that Elias had ordered him to watch over the nurse without asking her permission, and that on the 3rd night, when she stepped outside, he had driven away because he didn't know what he could possibly say to her. Elias sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened the desk drawer, took out an envelope he had prepared beforehand, and placed it on the table between them. Inside were documents in Tobias's son's name, a job across the ocean, and plane tickets for 2 weeks later. Tobias looked at the envelope without reaching for it. You take care of him, Elias said. I'll take care of him too. I arranged that position before you sat down here, so don't think I just came up with it to buy you. He pushed the envelope a little farther forward. Go, he said. Go with him. Don't let me see you again. Don't call. Don't send anything back. This is the last decent thing I can still do for you, and I won't do another. Tobias Merrick sat there, a man in his 50s with broad shoulders and hands, covered in the calluses of 30 years, spent doing work no one ever listed on a resume. He picked up the envelope. Then he lowered his head and cried, quietly, without making a sound, his shoulders trembling inside that freezing warehouse. He wasn't crying because he had been cast out. He was crying because the thing he had feared most for 30 years had never been punishment, but being forgiven and having to live with it. Elias said nothing else. He stood, walked toward the warehouse door, and paused for 1 second at the threshold, just long enough to say over his shoulder that Tobias should leave within the week. Then he stepped outside into the cold. Josie reviewed the photographs on the USB drive during the mornings after her shifts, when no one else was in the pharmacy and she was still alert enough to read the small print. Most of the pictures had been taken at an angle, and in haste, the warehouse lights glaring across the words, and she had to enlarge each corner one at a time. The delivery schedule posted on the warehouse wall had been photographed regularly through many seasons, each image covering a single week. And the board didn't contain only the names of small pharmacies. It also listed hospitals throughout the region. She found St. Bridget Hospital on the 4th line from the top. She stared at the name for a moment, then did the thing she had known she would do from the instant she saw it. She opened her wallet, took out the piece of paper he had shown her that morning, found the date written in the corner, then worked backward through the photographs until she reached the correct week. She found it close to 7 o'clock in the morning. In the column on the right, across from the hospital's name, there was a box shaded dark with a marker, and inside it 3 words had been written by hand: delivery temporarily suspended, followed by a short note stating that the account hadn't completed payment of that period's fee. Beneath it was a list of the items being withheld. She read the entire list, and the second line named the category of pain medication used for terminally ill patients. The date on the board was exactly 3 days before the date on the piece of paper. Josie sat on the stool behind the counter for a very long time. She didn't need anyone to explain what those 3 days meant. She had worked on the 3rd floor inpatient ward. She knew what the final week of a person's life looked like, and she knew that when medication arrived 3 days late, those last days became harder than they ever should have been. No one had intended for that to happen. That was what made her feel cold. No one had sat in some room and decided that the woman should suffer longer. There had only been an unmatched payment line in a spreadsheet, and a process running exactly as it had been designed to run. She folded the piece of paper, placed the USB drive inside the brown notebook, and told no one. She said nothing for nearly a week. She carried it to work every night, carried it home every morning, and there was only one question in her mind: what would he do if he found out? She had sat across from him many times by then. She had watched 2 men walk between 2 rows of silent vehicles, without anyone laying a hand on them. She knew very well that he wouldn't shout, wouldn't smash anything, and that was precisely why she was afraid. He discovered it on a Monday night. Josie never knew for certain how, though she assumed someone among his people had been reviewing the same photographs and had moved faster because they knew what to look for. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the pharmacy door opened, and he walked in. He didn't remove his coat. He stopped about 3 yards from the counter, and the only sound in the store was the quiet hum of the stockroom fridge. "How long have you known?" he asked. Josie gave him the truthful number. He nodded once, very slightly. "How long were you planning to keep it from me?" he said. "I didn't know yet," she answered. He was silent for a moment. Then he said the sentence she had expected since the beginning of the week, and he said it in his most ordinary voice, no louder and no colder than usual. "You hid it because you don't trust me." Josie placed both hands on the counter. "I hid it because I do trust you," she said. "I trust you to do exactly what I know you'll do. I know you won't need anyone to urge you. I know you'll leave tonight, and I know the person who signed that line will never have to sit at a table and answer a single question." She looked directly at him. "Ruth Ellender will have to testify," she said. "So will Mr. Harlan. This entire town is about to stand up and speak about things people have hidden for years. If you handle it your way, all of that becomes meaningless, and your mother will become nothing more than an excuse." He looked at her for a very long time, and Josie couldn't read anything on his face. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him, neither forcefully nor gently. She heard his car start, then fade into the distance. For the next 36 hours, no one knew where he was. Sutton Pryor walked into his office at 8:10 in the morning and found someone already sitting there. The man was seated in the leather chair behind his desk, his black wool coat draped over the back of the chair beside him, and in front of him was a cup of coffee, taken from the very machine in the corner of the room. In the hallway, 7 men stood along the wall. They weren't blocking anyone. Throughout that morning, the company's employees continued moving through the halls as usual, taking the elevator, walking to the printer, and the 7 men didn't say a word to anyone, didn't watch anyone pass, and simply stood there. Sutton asked who he was and what he was doing in his office. The man didn't answer. Sutton asked again, louder this time. The man took a sip of coffee and looked out the window. At 9 o'clock, Sutton called building security. The guard came upstairs, stopped in the doorway, looked inside, then apologized and went back down. At 9:20, Sutton called the police. A patrol car arrived 20 minutes later, and 2 uniformed officers came up in the elevator, walked past the 7 men in the hallway, and entered the office. They asked for identification. The man behind the desk handed them a packet of documents that had been placed beside the cup of coffee. The 2 officers stood reading. One of them took out his phone and called someone, spoke for about 5 minutes, then closed the phone. They returned the documents to their original place. Then the older officer turned to Sutton Pryor and said the building had changed ownership, that the transfer had been completed the previous afternoon, that the man sitting in the office was the lawful owner, and that if the owner requested it, Sutton was the one who would have to leave, not anyone else. The 2 officers said goodbye and walked out. The building had been purchased beginning the week after the night at Whitfield Pharmacy. It hadn't been bought in haste. The former owner had been approached the morning after that night. Negotiations had gone through 3 rounds, and the previous 36 hours had been nothing more than the wait for the final signatures and a seal from the registry office. Sutton Pryor called his lawyer. The lawyer arrived at 10:30, sat in the chair across from the desk, opened his briefcase, and began talking about the rights of an office tenant. The man behind the desk let him finish. After about 15 minutes, the lawyer's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen, excused himself to take the call outside, carried his briefcase with him, and never returned. From then until the end of the morning, only 2 people remained in the office. Sutton Pryor didn't dare leave because he believed that if he stepped outside, he wouldn't be allowed back in. He sat in the visitor's chair in his own office and tried several more times to speak. He talked about contracts. He said everything he had done followed proper procedure, that the fee policy had been approved by his superiors, and that he had merely enforced it. He said that if this was about money, then everything could be negotiated. Not one of his statements received an answer. The man behind the desk looked out the window, occasionally turning the cup of coffee, now completely cold, halfway around on the desk, and he didn't speak for 3 hours. During the 4th hour, when the clock on the wall showed a little past noon, he finally spoke. He didn't change the way he was sitting. He spoke toward the window instead of looking at Sutton. "That March," he said, "your company held back a shipment for St. Bridget Hospital because the account hadn't paid that period's fee in full. The shipment arrived 3 days late. It included pain medication. My mother was on the 3rd floor inpatient ward, and her final 3 days were harder than they should have been." Sutton Pryor opened his mouth to say something. The man didn't allow him to speak. "I've been sitting here for 4 hours, he said. "You see, waiting doesn't kill anyone. It only makes people understand how small they truly are." Then he stood, took his coat from the back of the chair, and placed a thin file on the desk. He said it was a copy. The original had been sent to the Deputy Attorney General's office at 6 o'clock that morning, before Sutton had even set foot inside the building. He put on his coat, fastened the buttons, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused for 1 second without turning around, and said Sutton had until the end of the day to clear out his belongings. Then he stepped into the hallway. The 7 men moved away from the wall and followed him into the elevator. The mystery of the 4 o'clock call was cleared up in a way no one expected, and it began with a small detail Josie had overlooked for weeks. That night, the woman had called the pharmacy's landline. She hadn't called Josie's phone. She hadn't called the main switchboard. She had dialed the old number, the one Harlan had changed the area code for years earlier but had kept running on a parallel line because several elderly customers were still accustomed to dialing it. Josie asked Mr. Harlan where that number was still printed, and he told her it had appeared on Whitfield Pharmacy labels since before she was born. It took her several more days to trace the rest, and the person who helped her was Delphine Arcio, because the radio episode about Ruth Ellender had been heard all across the region, including in places where people had no home in which to listen. In that episode, there was a passage in which Delphine introduced the nurse behind the story, and clearly said her full name. They found the woman in the parking lot behind a supermarket across the county line, a place where several vehicles stayed overnight, and no one told them to leave. Her car was an old model from another era, with tape across the rear window, the back seats folded flat and covered with blankets. Josie drove there late one afternoon. The woman was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open and her feet resting on the pavement. And when she saw Josie approaching, she didn't stand. She only remained still and watched her walk the entire distance. Josie sat down in the passenger seat and closed the door. The engine wasn't running. It was cold inside, and it smelled like a place where someone had been living for a long time. The two women sat in silence for a very long while. Then the woman said she had heard Josie's name on the radio that very morning. She said she had replayed that part again and again to make sure she hadn't mistaken the last name. She said she hadn't intended to call. She had sat in the car all through the afternoon and evening, telling herself she wouldn't. And then late that night she opened a cardboard box on the back seat to look for something and picked up an empty medicine bottle. She handed it to Josie. The plastic had yellowed, the cap had been missing for years, and the label along the side was almost completely peeled away. But the name Whitfield Pharmacy could still be read, along with the small print listing the child patient's name and dosage. And beneath that, the telephone number. "I bought that for you when you were 3 years old," she said. "You had a high fever for 3 days. Josie held the bottle in her hand and said nothing. "I dialed that number," the woman said. "I only wanted to hear whether anyone would answer. Then you really did answer, and I heard your voice, and I couldn't say what I had meant to say. I made up the story about the heart medicine. Then you asked for an address, and I didn't have one, so I gave you the only address I could still remember." She turned her face toward the window. "I never thought you would actually go there," she said. "I thought you would give me a few instructions and hang up. The next morning, I realized I had sent someone walking through the night to an abandoned house, and I sat in this car all day because I was too ashamed to step outside." Josie opened her handbag. She took out a small slip cut from an old prescription form, yellowed with age. The handwritten ink faded. She had found it 2 days earlier in Harlan's wooden drawer, in the bundle at the very bottom, and she had sat holding it in the pharmacy for a long time before deciding to bring it. She placed it on the steering wheel in front of the woman. It carried her name, the name of a fever medicine for a small child, a date, and an amount that wasn't very large, still unpaid. The woman stared at the slip for a long while without picking it up. "He still kept it?" she asked. Josie said he had kept all of them. The woman touched the edge of the paper with one finger, then drew her hand back. "It was nothing," she said. "One time couldn't have mattered that much." Josie looked through the windshield at the empty parking lot and the tall lights that had just come on as the afternoon slowly darkened. "It mattered to me," she said, "because I don't remember anything else about you." The two women remained sitting in the silent car for a while longer. Neither embraced the other, neither apologized, and neither said she forgave. Then Josie opened the door and stepped out, leaving the slip on the steering wheel, and walked back toward her own car. The radio episode about Ruth Ellender aired on a Wednesday morning, and during the first week, 9 more pharmacies across 4 counties contacted the Deputy Attorney General's office. In the second week, more than 20 additional pharmacies came forward, most of them small stores in towns whose names no one outside the region had ever heard. Sutton Pryor was indicted, but the name that stunned everyone wasn't his. The person who had approved the fee policy from its earliest years was a board member named Helena Browdy, and Helena Browdy was a woman recognized by half the hospitals in the state because she had founded a major medical charity, a foundation devoted to providing free medicine to people who couldn't afford it. She had appeared on magazine covers. She had received medals, and that foundation bought its medicine from her own company at prices above market value, which meant the public's donations traveled in a circle and flowed back into their pockets, and every dollar people gave out of kindness made the machinery behind it grow a little larger. Josie met her only once, in the hallway outside a lawyer's office. She was in her 60s, with neatly cut silver hair, and she spoke kindly, like someone's grandmother. She said she had no intention of defending herself. Then she said that she slept very well, my dear, that she had slept soundly for decades because every year her foundation placed medicine into the hands of thousands of people, and she asked Josie how many people she had saved. Josie stood there holding the worn journal. "I don't count them," she said. "I only remember their names." That same week, one morning, Mr. Harlan placed an old tin box on the counter, the kind of cookie tin nearly every household kept for needles and thread. He opened the lid. Inside was money, bills folded into small squares, several handwritten checks, and envelopes marked with names. Josie asked what it was, and he said people had been bringing it in for weeks, and he had only been holding it for her. She counted it. The amount wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to cover even a quarter of the surgery, and no one in the pharmacy that morning pretended otherwise. But beneath the money was paper, and when Josie lifted the money out, she saw that the bottom of the tin was filled with letters. They were handwritten, most of them on lined paper, some in ballpoint pen, some in pencil, some in large trembling letters like a child's because the writer's hand was no longer steady. Every one of them was addressed to the insurance company. Each letter told a story. One person wrote about the night Josie walked 3 blocks through the snow to deliver medicine. Someone else wrote that she had sat on their front steps for half an hour and listened while they talked about the husband they had lost. Another wrote only 4 lines, saying, "I am 81 years old. She remembers my name, and she remembers the medicine I take. That is enough for me to write this letter." Mr. Curtis Halloway had been the one who thought of it. He told Mr. Harlan, and Mr. Harlan later told Josie, that he had been sitting at home looking at the donation message and feeling that he couldn't contribute much. "I drove a bus my whole life," he said. "I don't have money, but I know how to write." The claim was approved again 3 weeks later, and Josie understood perfectly well that it wasn't because someone at the insurance company had read those letters and been moved by them. The investigation had uncovered that the denial of coverage was connected to a clause in the contract between the insurer and the distribution company, a clause that should never have been allowed to exist. That was what overturned the decision. But when the lawyer submitted the stack of letters with the file, they caused the case to be moved to the top of the list instead of waiting for months. And in this story, months were something her daughter didn't have. That morning, as Josie arranged the letters back inside the tin, Mr. Harlan stood looking at the box for a long time, then suddenly said something he had never told anyone. He said there had been 19 vehicles in the parking lot that night, but only 7 of them belonged to young Mr. Voss. Josie looked up. The other 12 were delivery vehicles from independent pharmacies throughout the region, he said, places that had been paying the same fee for years, just as I had. 3 weeks before that night, I called every one of them. I told them I was going to stop paying, and I asked whether, if something happened, they would come. They said they would. Young Mr. Voss knew about it from the beginning, he said, but he never mentioned it, because letting that man believe the entire fleet belonged to him made him more afraid. Mr. Harlan closed the lid of the tin. "Young Mr. Voss lent me his shadow for one night," he said. "I've paid him back." The surgery took place on a Thursday morning, and everything went smoothly. By afternoon, Poppy had awakened, and the first thing she did was ask her mother when she would be allowed to have ice cream, because someone in the next room had promised her she could. Josie sat down on the edge of the bed and laughed, and she kept laughing longer than she normally would, because she didn't want her daughter to see her face at that moment. The man in the black wool coat stood in the doorway without coming all the way inside. Poppy saw him and asked who he was. He said his name was Elias. The little girl asked another question. "Are you my mother's friend?" He was silent for 3 seconds. "I'm someone your mother saved," he said. The child nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer, then turned back to her mother and asked about the ice cream again. The following afternoon, the 2 of them sat on the steps in front of the pharmacy, and Josie took a small piece of paper from her coat pocket. She told him it was the part she had cut away before placing the other note inside the bag containing his mother's belongings. She said she had cut it because that night she hadn't known who he was, and after reading what his mother had said, she had been afraid. She was afraid that whoever received it might be someone whom words like those could break. She said she had kept it for 4 years and had tried many times to throw it away, but she never could. She handed it to him and didn't watch him read. Written on that piece of paper was the final thing his mother had said before dawn. "Tell my boy that I'm not angry. I only regret that I didn't have time to teach him that he doesn't have to become like his father in order to be loved." The man who had sat for 4 hours in a room high above the city, without allowing his expression to change even once, the man who had stood staring at a slip of paper saying his mother once owed money for medicine and had been unable to speak, sat down on the pharmacy steps, lowered his head, and for a very long time afterward, he still couldn't make himself stand. Josie said nothing. She simply remained beside him, just as she had sat beside a woman she didn't know 4 years earlier, and she gave him all the time he needed. 6 months later, Whitfield Pharmacy was still open throughout the night, because it remained the only place in the entire region that was. On the wall behind the counter, there was now a small glass frame holding 3 handwritten slips, and whenever anyone asked about them, Harlan only said they represented 3 people he didn't want to forget. The lowest wooden drawer was no longer locked. He left the key in the lock, and when Josie asked why, he said that only things worth hiding needed to be locked away, while this was something worth allowing people to see. Mr. Curtis Halloway still stopped by every evening to collect his medicine, but now he didn't leave immediately. He stayed in the chair beside the window and talked to whoever happened to be sitting nearby. It didn't matter who, and on some nights he remained until Josie had to remind him that it was getting late. Ruth Ellender's daughter had moved back to live only a few blocks from her mother, and the two of them argued quite often during the first month, then eventually stopped. Poppy was healthy, and on afternoons when her mother went to work early, the little girl ran around the pharmacy shelves until Harlan pretended to threaten her with the task of counting pills. Every Tuesday, the man in the black wool coat came by once. Never when the pharmacy was crowded, usually near the end of the day. He didn't say much. There was always a cup of black coffee waiting on the counter, and no one in the pharmacy ever said anything about it. In the end, the most memorable thing in this story wasn't the line of idling cars parked in the lot at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, nor was it the indictments that were read aloud afterward. It was a woman who had lost almost everything and still refused to release the ring of keys clenched in her hand. It was an old man who kept an entire drawer filled with debts he had never once demanded anyone repay. It was an elderly woman who finally allowed herself to feel anger after so many silent winters. Human beings aren't numbers in a spreadsheet. They are names, and sometimes the kindest thing we can do for one another is simply make the effort to remember each other's names. If you or someone in your family is having to choose between paying for medicine and buying food, please speak with your pharmacist or doctor, because assistance programs exist that many people don't realize they qualify for, and silence has never been a good way to save money. If today's story touched your heart, please click the like button, share it with anyone you believe may need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so another meaningful story can reach you each day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who stayed beside you when you believed you were completely alone? Please leave a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear the deepest things held within your heart. May you and your family always be healthy, joyful, and at peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.